All right. So she is the Director of Transportation Policy and Programs at Ulupono Initiative. Katie is Ulupono Initiative's lead on policy for transportation and programs, advancement of cleaner, multi-modal transportation in Hawaii, and reducing our dependency on cars. Her current projects include right-sizing parking policies and helping expand immediate transportation choices and access to those choices. She brings 15 years of national experience in the transportation and planning, combining both to advance community visions and goals in many diverse communities across the nation. For example, using a combination of analytics and storytelling, she helps to help two West Virginia towns strategize around health, leading to 2 rail program implementation grants. She also helped to conceptualize a resiliency center in Washington State, operationalize multi-modal accessibility metrics in Florida, and develop a statewide transportation demand management framework for New York State. Prior to joining Ulupono's team, Katie served as a project manager of Renaissance Planning in Orlando, Florida, and a senior manager at ICF International in Washington, D.C. Katie holds a master's degree in public policy from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's degree in political science from Tulane University in New Orleans. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you. It's always so good to hear your own bio. You're just like, oh my gosh, like blushing. So, on an exciting note, actually, one of those West Virginia towns actually built their trail, and it just opened 2 weeks ago, I found out. So that was very exciting. That connected 2 towns with a big multi-use path. So for those of you that are excited about bike paths and new bike paths. So, all right, I'll just share my screen. I have, let's see if I can do this properly. I always seem to mess it up. And then let's see. This is not what I wanted. Would help if I could put the right things. All right, are you guys seeing the screen or the screen with my notes?
It looks good.
See the screen.
The screen, perfect.
Okay, I'm notorious for like getting it wrong and then people not telling me. I did 10 minutes of a presentation once and nobody told me that I had it backwards. So, okay. Well, thank you so much. I guess I've got a lot of interesting stuff on transportation. I suspect some of it will be new for folks. So hopefully I won't go too technical, too fast and too crazy, but we'll see how it goes. So, but we'll probably just like dive right in. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Ulupono Initiative, we are a Hawaii-based impact investment firm, and we make for-profit and nonprofit investments in the state's long-term self-sufficiency. And we do this in a few different sectors. We do this in local food, increasing local food production, managing water and waste resources more effectively, expanding renewable energy, and then within clean transportation, our mission means reducing fuel emissions and imports. And that's the sector that I lead. But you can kind of see we have quite a wide variety of different types of projects. You know, you may not know all of them. They're really just meant to give you an idea of the different things that we work on broadly. And so, let's do the next slide. So historically, we're a little over 10 years old. Ulupono had really been in the EV space, the electric vehicle space, which makes sense as sort of an investment firm. It's consumer choice, you know, you're trying to change the markets and those types of things. But it turns out for our mission, that's not sufficient for the goals that we'd set for ourselves. And so they realized they needed someone with a little bit more expertise in policy and planning, which is where I come in. So I was actually recruited for this job. I moved from Orlando, Florida, to come and take this position. And it was picked up 2 kids and a husband. So it was quite a big change. And what's sort of why I was well suited for it, maybe compared to other folks in the community here, is that I have a really broad background in transportation. It's really in transportation, community planning, and environmental issues. And I have covered a lot. I've worked in 11 states. I've worked from local government all the way up to the federal government. In all sorts of organizational settings. So that diversity, it turns out, is really useful when you're trying to create an impact strategy that has sort of no boundaries, or they have the boundaries we put on them. But the motto that I sort of have always worked by is that using the transportation policy and planning to advance our community visions and goals. Because the thing about transportation is that there is money in transportation. There are people investing in transportation all the time, so that it's constantly changing to a certain degree, or at least we try and change it. Whereas that's not always true in other forms of community planning and other types of topics. So, trying to have it serve our goals rather than us serve it. So for today's talk, I thought it would be helpful to kind of talk a little bit about Hawaii's challenges and how we think about things. I don't always dive into this too much. Like Dan is on and he's heard me speak about all sorts of topics, but I don't think he's ever heard my actual like dog and pony show pitch. So we'll see if he buys it more or less now, since he already knows me. So talk a little bit about that, a little bit about our approach. And then I'm going to kind of walk through two different types of examples. One is the parking reform strategy, which has been a culmination of 2 to 3 years worth of work and is continuing into the future. And then the vehicle economy study, which is a discrete project, that report that we released earlier in the year. And then just kind of like a little bit about what we've learned. So I have sort of a complaint about like planning and governmental processes in the state, is that nobody ever tells you sometimes what they've actually, like how they got to where they thought these things were true. And so I like to walk through how important our process is and why, and what it entails. So it's got a few components to it. The first one is that it's ongoing. Like we continue to do all three of these things all the time. But it's really about multidisciplinary research that focuses on access to opportunity, so that means we look at kind of all modes, and that we really try and dive into derived demand. Like transportation is a derived demand. And what I mean by that is that transportation doesn't exist for its own sake, right? Like it's something that helps you do something else, right? Go to work, go to school, get groceries. But all of that, like that contributes to that particular trip, is sort of up for negotiation. And I think it's important to sort of notice that, because when people talk in transportation circles, they act as if the system is the end. Independent sort of people. It's about congestion, it's about time delay, but it's not really about how people get to as many things as they can, as efficiently and potentially, as green as possible, and ideally as cost effective as possible. But we really do try and keep an eye on that, which means I read all sorts of crazy stuff: land use, energy, housing, tax policy, like you name it. I probably have read it in the state of Hawaii if it's been released in the past 5 years. It's both a point of pride and a sad statement about my interests sometimes, but that's one part of it. Another part of it is like really focusing on people, not just how they're traveling and what they need to achieve, but also the processes by which we understand what sort of community goals are. What are the existing forums? What are the places people have speaker series? What are the things that, tell us, we reached 10,000 people and this is what they told us. What do those things sort of say? And how do they, and what does that help us understand about sort of collective community visions? And not just in one process, but across all these different processes, particularly when it comes to climate. And, I think there's a fair critique around planning that sort of talks about how like, well, I wasn't asked and we didn't get to that community. And those are all 100% fair. But what you do see over successive sort of engagements is pretty much an ongoing, longstanding commitment to dealing with climate change in this community. That is not true everywhere. I came from Florida. You couldn't even say climate change in policy circles and have that mean anything. So, I think trying to sort of parse out what shows up really consistently over time versus, what might be like of a certain time and era. And lots of talk stories, lots of meetings, lots of forums, really going out and meeting with people and just kind of understanding their situations so that we can be as impactful in our decisions as we can. And then the last thing is doing systems mapping, which is pretty big in the sustainability community, but not necessarily others. And really what it is that you sit down and you write out like what kinds of forces influence people's decisions, and like what are the feedback loops, and why is it so hard to get people to consider other forms of transportation. And it's kind of an impressive process, which we continue to do. But the thing where it's really helpful is that it's got a lot of discussion around sort of constantly evaluating if your actions are making a difference or how the system might be changing and how you can lean in and take advantage of that. So that's kind of like a higher level. It's a little wonky. I apologize. I don't know how to make it less wonky and still be meaningful. This is my ongoing challenge. But hopefully that gives you a sense of like how important the process is to us, not just the impact. And, on a sort of a project level basis, we do evaluate it on these types of things, which is like, one, what is the impact? How will it move the needle in Hawaii in a measurable way? Two is the opportunity. Is there space for this system's change? Like we could certainly have there could be a big impact, but we might not be able to do anything about it. I love this phrase sometimes where people talk about how like it's true, but useless. Like, yes, there is a big impact, but no, there's nothing you can do about it. So it kind of reflects that. And then the last one is timeliness. If it's not the right time, like what would make it the right time? And can we keep an eye out for that? So that's kind of the overarching, I'd say, lens that we look at things through. So let's dive in a little bit to how we talk about the issues. So we cannot become more sustainable without tackling ground transportation. This is our greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Hawaii since 1990. And you can see we have this like increase, and then this lovely drop, and then this ongoing drop. And that's the total emissions across all sectors in light of population change, economic innovation and development, all those sorts of things. And that's a great space to see. However, you will notice this green is where ground transportation has been hanging out. So I guess like the good news is we haven't gotten worse, but we haven't gotten any better since I was in middle school. And that's a real challenge. And that's a challenge that every community in America is facing when it comes to greenhouse gas mitigation, that we just have not seen the same type of progress in these issues, the same way you might have seen in energy, for instance. Although we are clearly leaders in energy, so that's maybe an unfair comparison to some other states. But this is going to be a real challenge. And there's really two ways of dealing with reducing ground transportation emissions. One is through the electrification of vehicles in the system as a whole that's powered by renewable energy. And then the second one is actually just reducing travel demand, or the trips people make, the miles they drive, how many they take, and all those types of things. And because of the strength of the energy sector and our decarbonization there, there's a lot of folks, I think, in the transportation sector who feel that if we just electrify all the vehicles, we can figure this problem out and we'll be okay. And that's not really possible. About half of the emissions reductions really do have to come from reducing what we call vehicle miles traveled. So that's the aggregate of miles that everybody drives in like a given time period. And the reason kind of why this isn't enough for our climate goals, broadly speaking, is, evidenced in this image, which sort of shows you that, biking and walking have nothing in terms of emissions. Bus and train, you get a little bit more per kilometer. So this is obviously a European model, but then you start to see that even within the EVs, there's still emissions at the end of the day, even with green power. They're definitely better than, I love this, average Victorian car. But, at the end of the day is that, eliminating miles is a lot easier, and more substantial and impactful than just greening them. And so that leaves us with this, well, how are we going to deal with that issue? Like, how are we going to reduce vehicle miles traveled? Well, actually, the first thing is, sorry, I skipped ahead one slide. The important thing to also note is that generally speaking, vehicle miles traveled are on the rise and they are projected to rise. We have no real mechanism in place to really reduce vehicle miles traveled substantively across the state. So what does that leave us with? Well, we have some great analytics in this state. I will tell you that, we complain about the lack of data on a lot of issues, and I don't think that's necessarily false, but we also do have a lot of great reports that sort of outline ways of doing things. And this one is from Transcending Oil, and basically they sort of articulate that about half of it is sort of introducing prices into road use, essentially. So trying to increase the amount of money you would pay as a motorist or a driver to use the space, essentially, to have that match some of the costs. So that's about 49%. A lot of times this is, tolling, congestion pricing. It's a whole host of different types of tools. The second next biggest one is parking, which it doesn't say it here, but is actually also introducing parking into this space. So we'll talk a little bit about this later, but essentially there's no such thing as free parking. You are paying one way or another. The question is whether or not you're paying as a driver. And then the last sort of quarter, for lack of a better term, is a whole host of sort of like urban development strategies around greater density, improving the uses of land so that they're mixed and not single use, new transit and street connectivity. But I think what's really important to sort of note though, is that for us to get to this space, about 3/4 of our impact has to come from what are essentially policy mechanisms. They're not building new bike paths necessarily. It's not these big infrastructure investments. It's actually just asking people to make better decisions on an individual level about the costs and total benefits in our communities, or forcing them, let's be honest, right? That's probably the more likely scenario. But I think it's really powerful to recognize it. And the reason why this particular mechanism is so powerful here is because the way we generally solve for transportation problems, particularly around cars, is to expand the roads, right? If there's congestion, well, we just need another lane. And that's pretty much been the answer for about 50 years. But as this cartoon sort of illustrates, within a fairly short amount of time, it's about 3 years, generally speaking, that entire capacity is filled. And we are in the exact same position we were previously. And if you think about this, this matches your general lifetime experience, right? In that, has anybody ever lived in a community that has been able to build its way out of congestion? We haven't done it here. And it turns out that nobody's been able to do it in US history. So, I mean, you might get a short-term relief in the 2-year period, but realistically, over time, that is just not what happens. And there was an analysis done by Transportation for America where they looked at this across the 100 largest urbanized areas in America. And regardless of your population growth and regardless of how many lane miles you built, nobody's in congestion ever got any better. So even if you declined your population, like you lost people in your region and you built more miles, you still were more congested now than you were in 1990. And in Honolulu, we are 166% more congested than we were in 1990. So why does this happen, right? And I'm walking folks through this. So I'm actually going to ask you at the end if I did a good job and it makes sense, because this is kind of a little gnarly. So the reason this happens is something called induced demand, right? And we kind of talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to show how it works, right? So general understanding is more roads and lanes equals less traffic. False, right? What really happens is that more lanes and roads happen and it induces demand. And inducing demand is basically that when the supply of something increases, like a new road, and there's sufficient demand, and if the price doesn't change, then more of a good will be consumed. So people will essentially fill that new supply, that new open space. And what we see happening in the research over time is that essentially when that happens, people drive 10% more than they did prior to that new road being put in or that new lane. And so essentially that's what we've done and why VMT has risen in the past and continues to rise into the future. That's why addressing those issues in both the parking space and in the roadway space are really important and have such big impacts. It's also why we then end up focusing on them as our top 2 leveraged opportunities. Because they have this biggest impact, and we've determined that there's some opportunity and timeliness to some of these issues. Now, we also, although I won't get into them in detail today, do talk about analyzing and seeding and building capacity for multimodal solutions, kind of taking that last quarter, right? We work on that, getting solutions on the ground right now. And then because there will be vehicles on the road at any given future, realistically, making sure that the ones that have to be on the road are electric so that we maximize the renewable energy resources we have on island. So now I'm going to dive into parking. Dan, you can zone out because I'm pretty sure you know all this. Dan was a part of actually our group of network champions on one of the projects here. So But this is the culmination of 2 to 3 years worth of work. It's still continuing. If you have suggestions, let me know, because we continue to work on this topic. We've talked a little bit about why right sizing it, which means getting the supply and demand to be the right sort of price point and economically efficient is important. But it's also a strong predictor of mode choice. In your own lives, most of the time, if parking is difficult somewhere, you're willing to engage and think about other options, basically. And that pretty much holds true across most people. It's also honestly a recognition that it contributes pretty dramatically to our increasing cost of living, and acknowledging that impact at the end of the day, that all the parking that you maybe don't pay for as a user really does add to a lot of our cost of living. And we'll walk through that a little bit later too. The opportunity is that it's local control and it's sort of underutilized. This is one of the few topics in transportation that you don't have to go to the federal government or the state government for. It's entirely local government controlled. And on the timeliness side, you can see we've had a lot of sort of movement in this topic, different projects, different initiatives, different policies. You don't necessarily have to know all of these. I just like to show that, like, it's not just one project. There's a lot happening here. So we talk about parking. We have a lot of it. This is specific to Oahu, but if 3 spaces per car equals 1.5 million spaces, if you do the math over time, it becomes over 17 square miles, which is 15 times the size of Waikiki on this island. And most people here think land is pretty constrained. So you can imagine what we could do with 1 or 2 lands worth of Waikiki if they were converted. And if they were all being used, then that would be one thing. But it's actually pretty underutilized. The estimates are sort of from a lot of American cities, is in the 25 to 45% range. Our number appears to be around 25 to 30% from a variety of sources, including me. When I went out and did late night parking utilization studies at condos that have been built in the last 20 years in urban Honolulu, they all came out solidly as being 30% underutilized. Now, what does that mean? It means that 30% of the spaces had no cars in them, in condos in this community in the middle of the night. So presumably people were home, they were using the maximum amount of parking spaces. There's 30%. So, most places have more parking spaces than units. You can imagine that being 200 or 300 units in some of these larger residential towers. And we also help other folks. We got a request in from Columbia University and Hawaii students to go out and do an intensive parking study. This is in Ala Moana. They tested out a bunch of technologies and tried to find out how many parking spaces, both on street and off, that are in Ala Moana. And the number is 32,000 spaces in one of our most accessible communities. Now, granted, there is a very large mall there, a shopping center, and I understand that, but that's still a lot of parking. And it's not even fully utilized on Black Friday, which arguably is probably the highest parking demand they would ever face. We also invested in focus groups, right? People are used to not paying for parking. Heck, I will even go a little bit further to not pay for parking, and I understand the implications of that decision. But what makes everybody sort of willing to make that trade-off? The difference is that I'm usually perfectly happy to pay for it too. And how do we get people in that mind space? Like, what makes it worth it? So, or makes them think twice about those things. So one is that we don't have enough parking technology here. The easier you can make it to pay, the more likely people will pay. I was sort of shocked when I moved here to find out I had to carry quarters again. It had been a really long time since that had happened. And that's a barrier to making people okay with paying to park. The other one is actually understanding the costs here. There's always this sort of discussion that Hawaii is different and it's not the same here, and 100% legitimate. But it wasn't clear that that was true in the parking space and around the construction costs, which is why we actually commissioned a study on the costs of parking and what it does to housing costs here in Hawaii. So broadly speaking, actually our parking costs on the low end are very much comparable with the mainland. It costs about $5,000 to build a regular sort of flat space, at a house, at a, in a commercial space or whatever. Those usually cost about $5,000 anywhere in the state, and then mostly the same on mainland. Where we are very unusual is how much it is on the high end. The high end is about $60,000. And that's in Kauai if you were trying to build like a commercial garage. So a multi-level kind of parking garage, you know, situation. But no matter what island you're on, you're looking $50,000 and plus. So, you know, very, very expensive. When we talk about what it does to monthly rent payments, it can be anywhere from $180 to $410 on this island. If you were making half the median income here and you were looking at a studio in urban Honolulu, it would be 37% of your rent would be subsidized, paying for the parking, whether or not you had a car or not. So let's be clear. If you were trying to buy a condo here, it would be about 20% of the average condo purchase. So essentially what your down payment is, again, regardless of whether or not you have a car or you plan to have a car. And if you are a retail store owner, you're looking at about 1 to 2% of your gross sales. If you're a customer there, you should, and you go there every week, say it's like a grocery store, you should sort of expect for it to be 1 week's worth of your groceries is paying for the free parking. Now, that is not to say that people wouldn't make that trade-off. I myself would be more than willing to pay for parking when I go to the grocery store because I don't want to deal with it. We're a family of 4 and I have kids who drink more milk than anybody should, honestly. But we aren't asking people to make those decisions. There's lots of people where they would not want to pay that. And so I think that's what's really important about parking is that we've taken away a lot of choice for people and saddled them with the costs in the meantime. Which is why I'm very pleased to announce that last year, Honolulu actually did an off-street parking overhaul, which is the parking that is when you in private development or just on the land use side, so on the development side, as opposed to the on-street. And this is where Dan and I actually met, is that he was also a part of helping support and figure out how we could get some of these things passed. But this ordinance was passed and it helped simplify the regulations. So it just cut down a lot of them, making them streamlined, a lot easier to go through. It went from 15 pages of costly parking mandates down to about 2 or 3. So it's just a cleaner system now. It also reduced and right-sized parking mandates. So in the urban core, there are now no longer any costly parking mandates on anything but non-residential land. And then they reduced the mandates across the rest of the island. It created flexibility for developers and residents. So it allows developers to build the amount of land that they want to, or build the amount of parking they think they need for the market. And it allows residents to also choose now in a way that has not been available for pretty much the past 50 years. And it also helps prepare for the future. More flexible loading zones. Everybody knows how much Amazon's like gone up in the past 10 years. Like that's a totally new demand in condos, and it allows them to be more flexible going forward and more joint and shared use, and also promotes unbundling as an incentive, which essentially means that it's separating the cost of the housing from the cost of the parking, which a lot of times is combined in most communities. So now there's an incentive that if you want to unbundle that, you can take advantage of not doing the costly parking mandates. So, and because we focus on impact, I had run this analysis, and basically 100% of the island is now facing reduced development costs, just flat out. It's cheaper this year to build than it was last year in the same type of product. The second thing is about 30 to 40% of the island, depending on if we're talking about population or geography, now faces no new mandates. So that's the black area right here. So it's around the rail lines. It's all these places where multimodal options are, you know, either available or plan to be available in you know, the near future. And then the other thing is that for every person we can get to live in these black areas over the white areas, their household vehicle miles traveled is 60% less than if you live outside of them, which means by, you know, the likelihood of them driving less, for being congestion, for all those sorts of things drops dramatically if we can get more people in this space. And it's also plausible that we also opened up about 500 vacant properties across this area and just about under 800 acres for redevelopment within this black area by removing the parking. We don't know for sure. Those are the ones that are possible. But it is quite a lot of land that was previously not developable. So we'll see how that plays out in the future, but those are some of the estimates. And then the last thing is, well, that was a big thing last year. That was quite a lot of work. We've had some things this year. Donald Shoup, who is sort of the one who created this entire sort of discipline of parking and the high cost of free parking. He spoke at the Better Tomorrow series 2 weeks ago. I should make the link available for folks. You can watch it. We conducted an omnibus survey 500 people across Hawaii, and whether or not they're willing to pay for parking in order to either to receive some personal benefit or community benefit. And 50% of people said yes, which was much higher than I was expecting, to be honest. So we're going to be exploring that. And then promoting local resources like ParkLink, which is actually an app where people can rent out private parking so that you have access to parking in a lot of these communities. So, and that's a local company here that, you know, we like to sort of flag and highlight as an option for folks. All right, so that's like a big strategy. That's a whole lot of things, and it's probably only 20 to 30, maybe 40% of what we've done over the past few years, but it shows you like some of the storytelling we do, some of the analytics that we do, the grants that we make, and the investments that we sort of move forward with, and some of the lobbying that we do. So next up is a similar topic as the annual costs. Apparently, I really needed to have costs to make anything move, but as you'll recall, road pricing, right? So how do you know what price to charge people if you don't know what the costs are? Well, it turns out we really wanted to know what that was, and this is a deep dive into that question at a state level. And I'll walk through this a little bit later, so don't feel like you have to read every piece of it right now. So what is a vehicle economy? So the vehicle economy includes all roads, vehicles, and transportation infrastructure costs, as well as the indirect costs, right? Costs of pollution, congestion, injuries and fatalities, et cetera, that result from the use of the ground transportation system. And we got interested in doing this study here because Massachusetts did one. So we're actually the second state to really do it. And basically a legislator there had the same questions we did, but he had the Harvard Kennedy School available to him. So he asked them to dive into this, and they came up with a number that was $64 billion a year, which is a lot of money. And we were sort of fascinated, like, well, what could that be in Hawaii? So, you know, back of the envelope, if you take it by lane miles or people, we're looking at $8 to $13 billion a year. And then half of that is public money. So when we talk about rail being really expensive at $13 billion a year, well, we are actually paying that every year with our road system. So, you know, it puts a few things in context. But because we are who we are, we wanted to know what it really was here. So we kind of had this framework associated with it, which we wanted it to be comprehensive, which is really what the Massachusetts methodology provided. We wanted it to be easy and defensible. We used really conservative estimates, and there's not a lot of there's not a lot of uncertainty in each one of the costs, right? Like it's not like a model where step one has some uncertainty that gets bigger in step two, it gets bigger in step three. These are all sort of discrete things that then just get added up. It had to be Hawaii based. We wanted it to be as based in the costs here as much as possible. Massachusetts has 300 municipalities. They did not go to every community and pull all that information. But in Hawaii, with one state and 4 counties, it's a much more manageable approach. So we did that here. And that it's replicable, that we didn't have to be the only ones who could do that this is something that can be sort of in the public domain. I've given this presentation, this part of it a few times, and I've been told very clearly, do not bury the lead. So I'm not going to. I'm going to tell you what you should take from this project, and we can argue about it, but this is what I see when I look at all these numbers, is that at $21.8 billion a year, our transportation investment strategy is unsustainable, and it continues because of indirect and hidden costs and a lack of evaluation of outcomes, including its contribution to our expensive cost of living. So let me tell you why I think that's true. So here's the entire full amount in one wonderful graphic. So half of it is consumer borne costs. So that's what you pay at the end of the day for your car. You know, what does it cost you to, you know, the mileage, the maintenance, all that kind of stuff, as well as what you might pay for parking in your own home. The other half are these public borne costs. And that is quite a significant amount. And this covers the direct budgetary costs, the indirect social and economic costs, and then the value of the land that's used for it. And I'm going to move. Sorry, one more thing. And the consumer borne costs on the bottom, they come out to about $8,100 per vehicle per year, just to give you a sense of those numbers, right? So that's like the average what people pay here for everything. In the direct public costs, right, we're looking at $11.2 billion a year. But what's really kind of critically important here to note is that the direct budgetary costs are 14% of that total, right? Of this half. but they drive the other remainder of that money. So the indirect social and economic costs are a direct result of our budgetary decisions, as well as the land value costs, which is the other 35%. So when we pay attention to things and making decisions, we very rarely include these indirect social and economic and these land value costs in our decision making, and we probably need to be doing so, because otherwise we are kind of ignoring a lot of the impacts associated with it. So other takeaways that were not in that fun graphic is that the user fees, so the amount you pay in gas and vehicle registration fees, only covers about 49% of the expenditures, which means that other half is actually borne by everyone, which may include you as a car owner, but actually it also includes everybody who isn't, which is around 10 to 15% of our population here on island. And then there's about 43% of our households here on this island have one car or less. So there's some real inequities built into that system. The public amount of money ends up being about 15,000 per taxpayer, or 24,000 in taxes per household that is ascribed to that. And that the maintenance backlog, so how much we think we have to keep that's been identified to keep the system running, is twice what we're investing right now. When we look at an individual household impact, when you put that all together, the private vehicles and all these public costs, we're looking at about $40,000 a year. Now, obviously not everybody pays that in the same way, because people's tax burdens are different and stuff like that. But that just gives you like sort of the aggregate when we split it across all of us, which is about 51% of the pre-tax income, median income here in Hawaii. So it's a pretty significant amount of money when you pull all these pieces together. So, and that's really what we were trying to shed light on, which is like, what are the types of things that need to be accounted for as we move forward realistically? And so kind of the last thing about our takeaways from our approach, and then we can open it up, is, having champions, identify and organize champions and build your network of partners. We are always doing that. And I don't ever work alone. That's not really my style, nor do I think that's the right thing to do in public policy and planning. Another one is data. Get the data that can change minds. Not every data point is actually going to change people's minds. You have to figure out what will change minds and what does that mean. And so that's kind of why we spent money on certain types of things, but not others. Like, I don't have a parking supply inventory of the state of Hawaii, because I don't know that that's going to change anybody's minds. The estimates kind of work, and I'm not really sure what you do with that. So another one is lived experience as a data point, understanding the users, paying attention to why people are traveling. What are the things they need to accomplish? Those types of things are critically important. We have a tendency to look over that a bit. Momentum works, incremental works, although the ground transportation system is pretty resistant to change. So that's a tough one too. And then I think localize. I hear this a lot, like, oh, we have such car culture here. We love our cars and all this kind of stuff. And I will tell you, having worked in 11 states and across the country, every community says that. So our problems really aren't that different, at least not in transportation. Frankly, they are pretty much the same ones everyone else is facing. But I think we really have to pay attention to the fact that the solutions need to be localized, right? They need to reflect that context and that understanding. So, and that's kind of where we're always interested in working more in. So, and that's all I've got. So hopefully I wasn't too long. I have a challenge in talking too fast, so I try and slow down, but then maybe I don't do it. Maybe I go too long then. So,
well, you did a great job at keeping to time, because we are a little over time right now, and I know that if you have some questions, it's okay. We only have an hour every meeting, so it cuts quick. It gets up to it quick. So, I think there was a couple questions here. Maybe you can just address a couple of them after. I did want to, if anybody does need to leave, because I know it's a little past 7, please jump off. But we can, if you want to stay on to answer a couple questions, we can, if that's okay with you.
More than happy to. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess to close our actual meeting, we always like to do our 4-way test. So I'm going to just do that really quick. And then after that, we'll jump into the questions. Hold on. Let me share my screen really quick. So really quick, 4-way test. The 4-way test are the things we think, say, and do, and everybody can jump in and say, number 1.
Is it the truth?
Truth. Number 2, Is it
Is
Is
it
it
fair
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 to all
to all
concerned?
concerned?
Number 3, will it build
To build
Goodwill
goodwill
and
and
Goodwill and better friendship?
And number 4, will it
Would
be
be beneficial
beneficial
to all
concerned.
And last but not least, number 5, is it eco-friendly? All right, so if you have to jump off, please do. This is being recorded, so if you want to get the tail end and any questions, feel free to watch the recording later. So couple questions here, really quick.
Yeah.
We had, someone was asking in regards to parking spaces being assigned to vacation, VRBO or Airbnb condos and stuff. And they were asking, because you had mentioned that so many parking stalls are just empty at night. So I think they were asking about that.
Can I jump in on that one? My question was, when did you collect that data, and did the pandemic have any kind of effect on the empty spaces due to the second homes not being occupied?
Sure. So I collected in 2019. So this predates the pandemic. And we actually made particular care to go to places that were considered locally occupied. So I can't guarantee that because nobody's going to give me like the list that proves that. But generally speaking, we were looking at places that were not the ones that have been accused of being mostly empty or empty due to second home ownership. So we looked at ones, and generally speaking, I mean, I guess I have to take the managers at their word that that's true, but I'm not a regulatory agency. So, but the fact that it came in all 8 of them, regardless, I think is really telling, especially when that number is also in a lot of the city documents. So you have these independent sort of verifications. And then when you know the national numbers, like it makes sense that we would be on the low end because it's really expensive. But, because like some of the places where it's like 70% underutilized, it's like Kansas City, like it's almost not even a relevant, data point. So I mean, it's not perfect for sure, but there's nothing to suggest that it's actually that far off. And if it is, it's often like small percentage points, right? Because if we had gotten even one that was like 20% or 10% underutilized. Now, the thing to keep in mind though, is that these mandates, the last time they had done it beforehand had been in the 90s, but there are a lot of like, older buildings from the 70s that do have like an overcapacity problem. What's great now with the new ordinance though, is that those people can talk to the new condo owners and they can now all share in a way they couldn't previously. So now you can kind of like, so if there's an excess in the building next to you, you don't have to build it. You can actually create an agreement and now like they can go just next door if need be. So that's where it gets really useful. So
That park link thing that you're talking about?
yes.
Oh
no, that's really, that's more for open access private, like where you like a lot of condos don't let you bring people in, although it depends on like the ownership documents and stuff like that. But hypothetically, Parklink could very much be used by a condo like an AOAO to do something like that for sure. But it's mostly like if you wanted to rent out, you're in like a duplex or something or a single family home and there's, not a lot of space and you're like, well, for $100 you can park in my driveway, that kind of stuff more.
Someone was asking, how do you envision our club partnering with things that I guess that you guys do? Is that right, Linda? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
I mean, I think it sort of depends on the topic. I actually don't do a lot of like direct partnerships with volunteer organizations like this, but I do a lot of support with other types of nonprofits. So a lot of the partners you work with, we provide different type, we work with on a variety of issues. So I'm trying to think like, so I'm going to use Daniel as an example because you're here, right? You guys partnered with Better Block Hawaii to do the trees in Kaimuki on a bunch of the parklets. Well, one of our investments was Better Block Hawaii in those parklets. So we invested money in those parklets. So, and then we've now got an additional grant with them to do capacity building for them to build their organization. So when they go out and put these parklets together, you guys can go and work on that. A big part of why I wanted to come talk to you is to just sort of show some of the framing and how important transportation is. It gets kind of a little, I don't know, it's kind of on the little like side of like the environmental world here in Hawaii. So I like to kind of point out like, no, we can't forget this. You go to affordable housing and cost of living conferences and nobody wants to talk about this topic. And we have not been super successful at raising people's wages, either in policy or in reality outside of a pandemic necessarily. And we really don't know how to build housing for less than $300,000 a unit, but I know how to help you shed your car. You know, we get you to move in or you live in and show you how to use it. Like we can do that now. Like I don't have to wait. So I think that's a big part of that is sort of conveying those messages and those narratives, because then when I go to lobby and do other things, then we have people we know who might be interested in hearing about some of these things too.
Yeah, on our,
I have a question on the pandemic, because in my experience planning, we're always like 10 or 15 or 20 years behind something. So right now we're in a pandemic where mobility has changed. How lasting are those mobility changes? The work from home, the need for whether it's, you know, public transportation impacts, you know, on and on and on, because these investments are, you know, in roads are, you know, century type investments.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but I think like one of the things about the work from home is that generally speaking, now people drive more. So it's not like this environmental solution realistically. And the way that we know that that's sort of true, because I know this always, I feel like half the time I'm telling people like, I know this surprises you, but I swear this is true in the research. But what ends up happening, right, and I'll use myself as an example, is that before I would walk my kids up to their school and I would hop on the bus. I would come down and then I would run a lot of errands on and off during the day when I was downtown. You know, I would pick up something from Walmart for dinner, those types of things, right? And then I would bus home. Now, I know not everybody buses, but what happens now though is that we are not necessarily in walking distance to the grocery store that I want to go. So that's now a trip. You know, I walk my kids, but a lot of people don't necessarily do that. It's just as fast to drive. And so, you know, I'm coming back to my house. So what we ended up seeing is that because people live in generally less accessible places than they work, their trips are now increasing. And the other side effect of it is actually that now that we don't have these peak congestion periods, the roads are significantly less safe. Traffic fatalities across the country are up something like 15%. And we're seeing some of that here. It's not the same. We're definitely seeing that same kind of trend this year. So there's already a lot of implications from that. I don't know. I mean, I think some of it is definitely probably long lasting. I think the bus lanes will probably last. I think some of the parklets will last. I wish we had seen a lot more of them, but that is an honest capacity issue that we have here. Just in generally speaking, is that we don't have enough people to do all the things that sort of need to be done. And I don't think that's, you know, somehow special in transportation. I think that's pretty true across the board for a lot of industries. So, especially if you're doing public policy and planning style work, I don't know where they're going to go. I mean, you know, the bus has almost entirely rebounded, and on some routes, it's even higher than it used to be. So, you know, I think it's just talking through some of that. I just wish that as we moved forward, we were taking a lot more of this into consideration in terms of decision making. You know, I don't know why we're spending, you know, new money on roads right now when we have so many outstanding needs identified across all the other modes. Like that doesn't make sense to me. And, you know, we've identified all of them and we know what they are, and we're just not putting the money we do have towards them. I mean, transportation does have money. On this island alone, over 4 years, they authorized about $2 to $3 billion. You know, I mean, like it's not insignificant amounts of money. We just authorized 400 million in new roads last month in this island. So, you know, that's real money. And it could have built the entire bike plan. So to put it,
is it actually costing that much to do whatever they're doing though, or is it like admin and is it really
it depends on what phase. Like that's the projects collectively are 15 miles, but like I didn't break out the individual sort of phasing behind them. Yeah, so that's the other thing, right? It's all we need to put money into infrastructure, like everything's shovel ready. Nothing's shovel ready. It's almost always right away acquisition and design. Like it'll be an economic construction incentive probably in 5 to 10 years. So
thanks, Katie. Some really interesting stats I hadn't thought about with the whole work from home aspect, and it's pretty scary on the accident.
It is very, sorry, Dan. It is very interesting what you put in perspective, Katie, because I will swear under my dead body that because of the pandemic, well, people were driving less, right? Because in my case, I work from home, and I will tell everyone like, oh yeah, I'm driving less now because I'm working from home. I don't have to go to work.
Mhm.
But hearing your perspective is like, well, no, everyone is in the same situation that I am, right? So it's very interesting.
It's more nuanced. We really don't know what's happening as much. And that's one of my ongoing complaints about data, right? Is that like the most recent numbers we have on vehicle miles traveled are essentially from 2017, and we don't have anything more updated. The types of data sources that give a more detailed update that aren't like, done by the state in the private market aren't actually available here. So that's like, I mean, talk about just driving me absolutely nuts. Like, I'd love to know if some of that's going on here, but we just don't really know, unfortunately, which I think is kind of crazy at the end of the day, because like, if we have these transportation agencies that are, supposed to help build these multimodal systems or maintain them, it seems like understanding how people travel is like a fundamental data point, or at least being able to talk about it sort of more comprehensively than we do. So,
hey, Katie, I actually have a question, if you don't
Sure.
mind. Yeah, so thank you. Excellent presentation. And I actually really love your graphics, by the way. So
Oh, thank you.
yeah, very easy to understand. I had a couple of questions. So my first question would really be sort of around your comment about data collection. And I guess, has there been any discussion within Ulupono, and this is just a thought, of partnering with Google or Waze or another very sort of well-used app to maybe purchase some of their data to gather, some of these apps are always on, right? So they're always tracking people's locations 24/7. And maybe that would give some better insight into how people move throughout the day. And then secondly, what is sort of your, I guess, projections, or have you had any conversations around the idea of the coming robotaxi initiatives and how that might improve or impact, I guess, your goals, what you're trying to do?
Sure. So with
Yeah.
Google, there are ways of getting that data, and actually the Hawaii Data Collaborative purchased some of that, but because of our population and sampling, it doesn't tell you like where they start and where they end. So like, we know when people show up in certain places and things, but it doesn't give us the kind of trip description that would be really useful. It's also, because it's a proprietary data source in a lot of cases, it's impossible to determine if it's representative.
Would you be able to, would
community.
there be any resources or potential interest in developing something then for people that are willing to volunteer for that, or maybe offer some sort of incentive over, I don't know, say 18 or 24 months to get a wider data set? Say, hey, you download this app and you get $5 off your monthly bill for, a year or something.
It's tough. I will tell you that like, when they want to go out and just survey people with the National Household Travel Survey that happens, and like a lot of that's changing, you were looking at, $500,000 to get a decent sample size. So like, it's not cheap data. I would love to be able to buy it from like Streetlight and Replica, which is the Google AI, right? But they don't serve us here. They do it everywhere else, and they're going to Europe, but they're not coming to Hawaii anytime soon. So I certainly keep an eye out, and we do think about some of that stuff. I also don't think, I think there's also a question about like, is it really my responsibility to be purchasing that data, or do we think that's really a transportation agency function? So we go back and forth. Like sometimes we sort of stay in our lane, for lack of a better term. And that's not to say, like, so if it was available to me for like a fairly nominal amount, if Streetlight, if I could get a license for, hell, I don't know. I don't want to say prices because then I'm just gonna be like, So, but like if for a reasonable amount of money and like I could have that information, I would probably do it. I do have it actually with Urban Footprint. I have modeled numbers, but that's about as good as it gets, honestly, in my world. So, but even that would be nice. So to have sort of a more official, that's been ground truth a bit more. And so to your second question about robo-taxis, what do you mean by that exactly? I want to make sure I understand, because that's not a term that I use regularly, but other people do. And it changes sometimes depending on the context.
Sure. So robo-taxis right now are not something that really exists, although I do see an ever increasing amount, it seems to me at least, of fully decked out rigs, cars that are just totally decked out with cameras and LiDAR, that are not Google cars, that are, in my opinion, testing self-driving perhaps, but I have no proof of that. But just on more of a broader, just to kind of explain the idea basically is that robo-taxis will reduce the need for the number of cars on the road. Going back to your point about parking spaces, you know, the other side of that is they say that most cars sit for 70% of the day or 80% of the day or whatever it is. And ostensibly, although not yet proven, if there were only robo-taxis on the road, you would need less cars overall, because those cars that would normally be parked would be in service during the time that, you know, when other cars would normally be parked. But again, this is also unproven. And then your initial point about freeing up capacity causes, you know, nature abhors a vacuum, right? So freeing up capacity causes more capacity to be had. And so perhaps, you know, even things like rail might cause more cars to get on the road in the future. But
so we actually did a report. I didn't touch it at all in this, but we actually did one around Hawaii's autonomous future. And the way the research kind of plays out in the planning community, broadly speaking, and the transportation community, is that there's sort of two scenarios. One is that like all of the benefits are sort of realized, that, you know, the safety benefits, we're able to provide transportation to people who can't drive in a way that's really meaningful, and that it's a hyper efficient way of providing even transit services, right? That's one version. The other version is one in which basically VMT doubles or triples, because there's nothing in place to stop it from happening that way. So whereas like right now you would maybe get in your car and drive to work, let's just say 5 miles, I'm making this up, right? You would 5 miles and you would park and you'd stay. Well, with an autonomous vehicle, what would happen is that you would go, you know, maybe it would pick you, it would be riding around, it would pick you up, it would take you to work, and then it would like maybe go back home or maybe go to other things, right? And then it would take you home. So the VMT that would be ascribed to you has just gone up significantly. I know that's not exactly the same as the taxi service, but that is like the high end that's been kind of put out there in the larger community. And I think without any sort of policy mechanisms in place, that's the more likely scenario, because again, back to the induced demand discussion, there's nothing making that decision match how much it costs us. So we might get more parking spaces back in the mix, right, that get used for other things, but you're probably going to see a lot more congested arteries, and that's, you know, congested roads and other types of things. So it's going to be pretty challenging. So yeah, it's on our website if you'd like to take a look at it. Like, we advocate for them being automated, accessible, connected, electric, and shared. So ACEs is the term that we use to really sort of say, like, we want to reap the benefits of this technology. But to your point, I mean, there's easily over several hundred autonomous vehicle pilots on the road in the United States right now. They're just not here in this state. But they are all over the country, and you may not even know about them, like, because they don't have notification requirements in a lot of these states. So it's kind of like some places are Wild West, like Arizona, like there's almost no regulations. California has some basics. So it's kind of all over the place. We have authorized a pilot here with Hawaii Department of Transportation. They are moving forward with one, but I don't know what that entails. So it hasn't necessarily been made more public. So
thank you.
I think we are getting close to 7:30, so I think we're gonna have to wrap up here. I think John's answer is a yes or no kind of question.
Yeah, presumably. I mean, I can tell you, yeah, yes. you know, a bus pass is a lot cheaper than owning a car on the, about like, it's 10 times as much expensive. So yes. And we see this when people join car sharing, like, and they give up their cars, their travel and their costs drop by about a third to a quarter. So, you know, I happen to be, we have one car, we only have one, and I am a family with 2 kids. So, and then Jen, the cost of roads on new roads are all road work. If it's the vehicle economy study, it is the costs that have been identified in budget documents. So it's whatever they're spending on both, essentially. So if it's like a new road that they're building, or if it's a repair, that'll include it. Although I think she left, didn't she? Oh, I tried to catch it beforehand. Oh, well, she can see it in the recording then, or someone can put it along. So yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for staying on, and thank you, Katie, for staying on as well. I really appreciate it. And this recording will be up on our YouTube as soon as I get to it, hopefully sooner than later. But thank you again, and we'll definitely, I think for Ulupono and what you guys do is there's so much more to it. But if anything, I think a lot of people may not know, it's more of the investment that you guys make for a lot of programs too. So maybe there's something that we can reach out in that capacity, less on like, I guess, volunteer work, but maybe if there's projects coming up or things of that sort, then we can participate in some capacity. So thank you.
No, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. So, and I promise I'll come the next time we have a report, and I'll make it a little bit less intense.
Thank you so much. All right, guys, take care. Be safe.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.